Rosamund Clifford, better known as Fair Rosamond, is one of those names that lingers on the edges of English history. If you've heard of her, it's probably as the tragic mistress hidden in a labyrinth, discovered by a jealous queen and forced to drink poison. It's a story that sounds more like a medieval romance than a chronicle of real life. And indeed, most of the famous details, such as the labyrinth, Eleanor's pursuit, and the poisoned cup, only appear in chronicles and ballads centuries later. Rosamond was a real person in the 12th century, the daughter of a marcher lord from Herefordshire, who became the mistress of Henry II. But the bare facts of her life are thin. What survives of her memory is less about who she actually was and more about what later generations, particularly our Tudor friends, wanted her to represent. By the 16th century, Rosamond's story had been woven into chronicles like those of Richard Grafton, Raphael Holinshed, and John Stow. She had been reborn in Elizabethan poetry, most famously in Samuel Daniel's Complaint of Rosamond, and her legend was sung in ballads sold in the streets. To the Tudors, Rosamund Clifford was not just a medieval mistress, she was a romantic heroine, a moral warning, and a symbol of the dangerous power of beauty. So, today we are going to talk about Rosamund Clifford, yes, but also how the Tudors saw Rosamund and how they created the image that we still have of her. Hi, friend. Welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast, the original Tudor history podcast telling stories of Tudor England since 2009. I am your host, Heather, of course, and I am, as always, delighted that you are here with me today to talk about Rosamund Clifford. Let's dig in. Most people who know the name of Rosamund Clifford know her through legend. The story usually goes like this. Henry II hid his mistress, the beautiful Fair Rosamond, in a maze at Woodstock Palace. When his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, discovered the secret, she tracked Rosamond down, forced her to choose between a dagger and a poisoned cup, and watched her die. It's a gripping tale of beauty, jealousy, and revenge, the kind of story that sticks in the imagination. But almost none of it is true. The labyrinth, the thread, the poisoned cup, these details only appear in chronicles and ballads written long after Rosamond's death. There is zero evidence that Eleanor and Rosamond ever met at all. What we can say with more certainty is that Rosamund Clifford was a real woman of the 12th century. She was the daughter of Walter de Clifford. She became the mistress of Henry II. And it's there in the very faint records of her life that her story begins. She was born in the middle of the 12th century, around 1150. Like I said, the daughter of Walter de Clifford, a marcher lord in Herefordshire. The Clifford family held lands along the turbulent Welsh border where loyalty to the crown was tested in constant skirmishes and shifting alliances. Rosamond's early life is obscure. Like most women of her class, her name surfaces only when she entered the orbit of powerful men. By the mid-1160s, she may have attracted the attention of Henry II. Later chroniclers claim she became his mistress, although no contemporary sources document when or how the relationship began. Henry seems to have acknowledged her publicly as his mistress only in 1174, but details of their time together remain scarce. The famous tales of the labyrinth at Woodstock Palace, Eleanor tracking Rosamond with a thread, and the poisoned cup appear nowhere in the 12th century records. These stories first emerge in written sources several generations after her death, reflecting popular romance and legend rather than any confirmed historical event. There's zero contemporary evidence that Eleanor and Rosamond ever met at all, let alone that Eleanor murdered her rival. These episodes are entirely literary inventions. What the records do show is that Rosamond withdrew from public life before her death. She retired to Godstow Abbey near Oxford, a Benedictine convent, where she died around 1176, still a young woman, only in her 20s. Henry II continued to favor her memory. Contemporary accounts suggest her grave was treated with unusual honor and adorned with costly trappings, though stories of lavish silks and constant candlelight may have been embellished over time. Her tomb became controversial. In 1191, Hugh of Lincoln, the reforming bishop later canonized as a saint, visited Godstow and was appalled by the devotion shown at Rosamond's grave. He declared that the nuns should not keep a harlot within the Church of God, as later chroniclers paraphrased his ruling, and ordered her body be moved out of the church into the cemetery. This act turned Rosamond into a public moral example. Although later ballads and tales sometimes claimed that she bore Henry's children, there's no reliable evidence that supports this detail. Her historical reality is very, very faint. The daughter of Walter de Clifford, the mistress of Henry II, retired to a convent and buried in scandal. But this slender biography provided fertile ground for legend. Within a generation of her death, Rosamund Clifford's story had begun to transform. Chroniclers and storytellers embroidered her memory with scenes that owed more to romance literature than to history. This is, of course, when we start to have the troubadours and the whole language of courtly love and courtly romance coming to England from places like Aquitaine. So Rosamond fits in perfectly with this. The most famous invention was the labyrinth at Woodstock Palace. Henry supposedly built an elaborate maze to conceal Rosamond from Queen Eleanor's jealousy. Eleanor in turn discovered the secret, following a thread into the heart of the labyrinth where she confronted her rival. In some versions, like I say, she offered Rosamond a choice between the dagger or the poison, and in others, Rosamond's death was swift, the result of Eleanor's fury. None of these stories are contemporary. They surfaced generations later in a culture shaped by medieval interest in courtly love, dangerous queens, and tragic beauty. The legend attached itself to real places. Visitors to Woodstock were shown Rosamond's Bower, and the site became a landmark of English romance. By the late Middle Ages, Rosamond's story was widely known, repeated in sermons and examples as a warning against illicit love. By the time the Tudors inherited the story, it was already a tradition. It would have been 350, 400 years old by that point. Rosamond was the hidden mistress. The queen was her persecutor, and her death was the price of her beauty. So let's talk about the Tudors and the chronicles that wrote down Rosamond's story. They didn't invent her legend, but they enshrined it in the histories that defined England's past. This is the first time we start to see things being written down and published with the printing press, of course. And Rosamond's story was important for them to get down. It was important for people. Obviously, people had been talking about it. And so the fact that it was published so often, and we have so many records of it, shows just how important she was for the Tudors. So there's people like Robert Fabyan, writing in the early 16th century. He included her in his popular civic chronicle. For him, Rosamond was Henry II's mistress, hidden in a labyrinth from Eleanor's jealousy. The story was presented as established fact. Then Richard Grafton, in his 1569 Chronicles at Large, expanded the story. He emphasized Eleanor's cruelty and the elaborate secrecy of the labyrinth, shaping the story into something more dramatic and moralizing. Raphael Holinshed, who wrote the Chronicles, became a standard reference for Elizabethans. He described Eleanor following the thread into the labyrinth and confronting Rosamond, dealing with her in such sharp and cruel wise that she lived not long after. Holinshed admitted that this simply was the common report of the people, but its inclusion in his massive chronicle gave the tale authority. Finally, John Stow's 1580 chronicle added a crucial detail. He named Rosamond explicitly as the daughter of Walter, Lord Clifford. Earlier accounts treated her more like a character in a romance. Stow's genealogical note grounded her in a real family, cementing her status as a historical figure rather than a nameless legend. Through these Tudor historians, Rosamond's story was canonized. Fabyan popularized it, Grafton dramatized it, and Holinshed broadcast it nationally. Then Stow tied it to a real lineage. By the end of the century, her story was part of the official narrative of English history. If the chroniclers made Rosamond part of the national record, Tudor poets and balladeers gave her emotional life. The most famous literary testament was Samuel Daniel's The Complaint of Rosamond from 1592. Here, Rosamond speaks as a ghost, lamenting her downfall and warning others of the dangers of beauty and courtly desire. Daniel presented her as a victim, seduced by a king, ruined by her own attractiveness, and consigned to eternal regret. He writes, "Out from the horror of infernal deeps, my poor afflicted ghost comes here to plain it, attended with my shame that never sleeps, the spot wherewith my kind and youth did stain it. My body found a grave where to contain it. A sheet could hide my face, but not my sin, for fame finds never tomb to enclose it in." And then he goes on, "So I through my beauty made the wofullest wight, by beauty might have comfort after death, that dying fairest by the sarest might find life above on earth and rest beneath. She that can bless with one happy breath give comfort to thy muse to do her best, that thereby thou mayest joy and I might rest." For Elizabethan readers, Daniel's Rosamond was not simply a historical figure, she was a moral lesson. The poem placed her within the popular Elizabethan genre of female complaints, giving voice to women who had suffered love, betrayal, or disgrace. For Elizabethan readers, Daniel's Rosamond was not simply a historical figure, she was a moral lesson, a tragic heroine who blurred the line between romance and warning. Her voice echoed other Tudor anxieties about women at court, people like Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, even Mary, Queen of Scots. Alongside Daniel's poem circulated popular ballads like A Lamentable Ballad of Fair Rosamond. These cheap prints dramatized Rosamond's imprisonment in a labyrinth and her murder by Eleanor. They added flourishes unknown to earlier accounts. There were towers and the poison cups and Henry's tears, shaping Rosamond into a melodrama for mass consumption. Performed in taverns and marketplaces, these ballads ensured that her story wasn't just courtly literature, but also popular entertainment. So in Tudor hands, Rosamond could be a ghostly moralist, a tragic beauty, or a cautionary example. The flexibility of her image helped her endure. Rosamond's story was reinforced not only by the chronicles and poems of the Tudor period, but also the survival of her burial place. Unlike many figures who drifted into pure legend, Rosamond had a tomb that visitors could actually see. She was buried at Godstow Abbey, just north of Oxford, in 1176. Henry II himself is thought to have contributed to her memorial, and the tomb was treated with unusual honor. Later writers described it as lavishly decorated, hung with silks, and constantly supplied with candles, though, of course, like we said, these details may have been exaggerated over time. What matters is that her grave stood out. Pilgrims and casual visitors alike came to see it, turning Rosamond into a kind of shrine figure, despite her scandalous reputation. That honor was short-lived. In 1191, when Bishop Hugh of Lincoln visited Godstow, he was horrified by the devotion shown to a royal mistress. He ordered Rosamond's body to be moved outside into the graveyard, stripping her of the dignity of a place inside the Abbey church. The act was remembered for centuries as a moral example. Beauty and royal favor could not protect a woman from posthumous disgrace. Even so, Rosamond's grave continued to attract attention. The site lingered in local memory, and by the Tudor period, it had become a minor landmark of English romance. Visitors to Oxfordshire were told stories of Fair Rosamond, and Godstow remained tied to her name. The dissolution of the monasteries added another layer to the memory. Godstow Abbey was suppressed in 1539, and its buildings began to fall into ruin. Rosamond's tomb was destroyed, or at least dismantled, part of the sweeping changes that tore down shrines, relics, and monastic traditions across England. But instead of erasing her story, the destruction of Godstow seemed to give it new force. The ruins of the abbey were described in Elizabethan times with a sense of nostalgia, the crumbled stones of a vanished world where a king's mistress once had been laid to rest. Travelers continued to seek out Rosamond's resting place. In the 1590s, the German visitor Paul Hentzner recorded the epitaph still faintly visible at Godstow. The Latin lines had read, Hic jacet in tumulo Rosamundi non Rosamunda, non rendulet sed olet solet. Translated, here in the tomb lies the rose of the world, not a pure rose, she who used to smell sweet still smells, but not sweet. It was a cruel inscription playing on her name Rosamundi, the rose of the world, while undercutting it with non Rosamunda, not a pure rose. The rhyme drove home a blunt moral lesson. Beauty fades, flesh decays, and even the most celebrated mistress cannot escape corruption. For Elizabethan visitors, the epitaph gave Rosamond's story a physical punch. The Tudor fascination with ruins also played a role. By Elizabeth's reign, the landscapes of England were dotted with the remains of monasteries torn down in her father's reforms. Godstow was one of many, but it carried an extra resonance because of Rosamond. Writers and travelers alike connected the fallen stones with her legend, as if the abbey itself was sharing something about the fragility of worldly glory. So while Rosamond's life was thinly recorded, her memory survived in a way that few other royal mistresses managed. The chronicles gave her a place in history, the ballads gave her a voice in song, and her ruined grave at Godstow gave her a lasting presence in the English landscape. So, Rosamund Clifford's historical life was faint. A Marcher lord's daughter, mistress to Henry II, retired to a convent buried at Godstow, posthumously condemned by a bishop. Yet her afterlife in legend was vivid. In the centuries that followed, and especially in Tudor England, Rosamund Clifford's shadowy historical reality faded as she became the vivid heroine, and sometimes the victim, of legend, morality tale, and national story. Chroniclers enshrined her history, poets gave her a tragic voice, ballads carried her into taverns and marketplaces, and her epitaph reminded visitors of the fleetingness of beauty. For the Tudors, Rosamund Clifford wasn't just a 12th century mistress. She was a symbol of desire, of danger, and the already existing fascination of England's romantic past. So there we go, my friend, a little bit about Rosamund Clifford and how they saw her. I hope you enjoyed this. As always, if you did, you can leave me a comment wherever you're listening to this. I do enjoy reading those. You can also hop into the Tudor Learning Circle to connect with me there. It's www.tudorlearningscircle.com, a social spot just for Tudor history nerds. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back again very, very soon. In the meantime, have an amazing week. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, send who may be sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte Bord in Bauerbricht, dat soll is semlis on sea.